Hello everyone, you're very welcome to this paper on designing and developing a board game to teach ethics for computer science students and ICT education. So the title of the paper is Homo, Ludens, Moralis, which is a reference to Johann Huizinga's 1938 book Homo Ludens, which talks about the importance of games and play in the development of culture and indeed in the development of society. So my name is Damien Gordon, along with Dr. Dimna O'Sullivan, Yanis Stavrakakis, and Andrea Carley. We're from the School of Computer Science in the Technological University of Dublin. So we're involved in a project called Ethics for EU with a number of European partners. And the goal of the project really is to look at, do computer science courses teach ethics in their courses, and are they doing enough of it? And it appears, based on the software that's being developed, a lot of IT companies aren't necessarily giving too much or enough thought to ethics. So the goal of the project is to see who is and who isn't teaching ethics to students, and then to identify ways of teaching it more successfully, more globally. So in a sense, the content we're developing as part of this project is aimed at two different stakeholders. We're developing content for the lecturers who teach computer science to help them understand approaches, teaching ethics, and indeed we're creating content that's pre-made for the students as well, that the lecturer can deliver to them. So if we think about Laurel Lard's conversational model from educational research, the teacher has a concept in their head. They communicate it through their voice or through imagery to the student. Unfortunately, as well as the concept, the teacher has a number of preconceived ideas and a number of assumptions and scripts and strategies, and the student may have different ones. So sometimes that can result in terminology that the lecturer thinks is very clear being confusing for a student because they're taking it from a different context. So really the goal of the ethics project is to back up the teacher and support them and help them learn ways of teaching ethics, and indeed help the students to learn about ethics, and particularly digital ethics or computer ethics. So for something reasonably straightforward like a software methodology, we can see how there's a number of stages in developing software. This is Scrum, and we can see how we might put in an ethics check in a number of stages. So that's reasonably straightforward, and we could identify that as being positivistic or positivist in terms of the type of teaching it is. It's very straightforward, and indeed it's quite similar to the kind of teaching a computer science lecturer would typically do. That's fine, but because this is ethics and we want to develop individual ethics in individual students, there isn't a correct ethical perspective or not. Each student must develop it from themselves. We need to look at more interpretivist approaches like constructivism, a la Mannheim, or advocacy, a la Habermas. And we identified a number of different bricks or Lego blocks to help form this new approach, this constructivistic approach, this interpretivistic approach. And games was one of them we identified as being one that could teach concepts that are more interpretivistic. Now, the history of games in teaching goes a long, long way. Games like chess, and indeed games before it, were developed to help teach people military strategy. And indeed, somebody like H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer, would have brought together a number of military strategy, miniature wargaming techniques in his famous book Little Games. And we're seeing it now, games being used in education, both in gamification, where we add game-like elements to existing teaching practices. We might add points or levels or rewards. And we're seeing serious games, which are regular computer games, but have educational value added to them. So we have the whole spectrum between educational content that has some game features and games that have some educational features. The approach we decided to use in terms of undertaking this project, and this aspect of the project in particular, was to use design science, which, as you can see, created by a very famous American inventor, Buckminster Fuller. That's a geodesic dome that he created behind him. So he probably at least pioneered the term design science. So to take the design as a serious process that we can identify processes within that process, and design isn't just about creativity, it's about following stages. For example, we might look at something like this and say we need to, in the rectangular blocks, identify the problem, define the objectives of a solution, design and develop that solution, demonstrate the solution works, evaluate it, and then communicate it effectively. So a clear methodological approach to undergoing a design process. And in this case, the design process started with creating paper prototypes. So this game is going to include cards as well as a board, so different designs for the cards. The one on the right is kind of like an old-fashioned BlackBerry. Ones on the left are in the style of a 2D block or in the style of a kind of web page. So we knew cards were going to be a big part of the game, and we felt it was important to think about a design. Ultimately, what we ended up doing is using Monopoly chance cards, community chess style cards. So a scenario has a scroll on the back of it, and you're given scenarios to see what you would do in them. For example, you're asked to write a system that will capture somebody's location without their consent. Do you do it or not? You're asked to write a program to deactivate the light that usually comes on when a webcam is active. So scenarios like this that in somebody's working life they might be asked to do. And then we have modifier cards as well, and the modifier cards say, let's change up the priority, the danger level with this scenario you've been given. So a modifier card could be something like, if you don't turn off the webcam, or if you don't capture someone's location, somebody who else will do it, who's a much worse programmer and might do much worse ethical damage. Or maybe a modifier might be, if you do it, nobody will ever find out it was you, or if you do it, your company will give £1 million to a charity or something like that, or they'll take care of the health of 10 people. So modifier cards force different players in the game either to choose to do things or not. Even if two players have the same scenario, they might end up choosing to do the opposite activity based on the modifier cards. When we were designing the overall game, we thought maybe at first that we could fit it in a small metal tin called an Altoids tin. They're a mint tin from the USA, and it's very common in engineering and computer circles to hack these Altoid tins into various electronic things. And indeed, people have put games and dollhouses and various things in them. So we thought it'd be fun, could we create the whole system in such a way that it would all fit in an Altoids tin, and we kicked around that idea for a while. Then we moved towards maybe a traditional 1 to 100 squares board game style, snakes and ladder style. And we considered having an insert in the middle to convert the kind of spiral into a Monopoly style board game. So just covering the middle bit allows you to have a Monopoly version of that board. We looked at other versions, including ones that the board would have 2 circles. One would have a transparent window that would represent 1/6 of the terrain. So there's a board on top, but 1/6 of it changes when a certain card comes up. And then one theme we stuck on a lot was the idea of Dante's 9 circles of hell, and just looked at, are you getting more or less ethical? And there would be only certain sections of the board you can move into the inner circle in. And indeed, that was the approach we chose to use in the end. So each player gets a mat as well, and the mat will store all their scenario cards and modifier cards that they get during the game. The players also have 3 sets of points. Their accountability, how accountable they are for things, their virtue, how virtuous or good they are, and then their loyalty, which is to do with how loyal they are to the organisation. And that's our logo in the middle, the Ethics for EU logo. So if we see the game in action here, we can see the mats on the left and right. And this is in mid-play, so we've tokens for each of the 3 points. There are some modifier and scenario cards on each of the mats as well. The board is in the middle. There's players moving around the board, and then we've some other cards to help players learn about new things or override information they get towards the bottom as well. So fortunately, before the COVID-19 virus came out too much, we had an opportunity to allow a few students to play this as a board game. They said things like they enjoyed it a lot and it was great fun. They also said things like, can these kinds of scenarios happen in real life? I had no idea. I never even thought about this sort of thing. So definitely the scenarios and the cards seem to have had a significant influence on them. They enjoyed the board game element a lot, but in fact the cards were the things they really felt they benefited from. So our findings based on discussions with the students were, first, that the board game was a really fun way to learn about ethics. Second, that the students hadn't considered many of the potential scenarios that they might encounter in their workplaces. But because of COVID-19 occurring, we really have concluded that board games might be less practical in this scenario than in others. So we might do a downloadable version of it, or maybe a computer game version of it. Although a lot of students did say they really preferred the board game because it was tangible and real and manipulable, whereas sometimes computer games can feel ephemeral and unreal in that way. Anyway, that's the paper. The project we're involved in is called Ethics for EU, and our website is www.ethicsforeu.eu, and our hashtags are checkyourtech and ethics for EU. Thank you very much.